I'll pray for us. Gracious God, thank you so much for the gift of today. Thank you for the beautiful sunshine. Thank you for this delightful congregation who has been so kind to host me. We thank you for the folks who prepared and who set out the breakfast this morning, for the folks who have given in so many different ways to make this possible. We thank you for the time that you have set aside for us to spend in your word. I pray that you would help us to see, help us to hear the voices of these ancient prophets who struggled to tell everyone the message that you gave them, who struggled to put it into words, who struggled to express their visions, who thought hard and long about how to break through all of the defenses that all of us put up against you, against your word, against the mission that you have called us to. Well, God, we ask that you take our hearts of stone and give us hearts of flesh. Give us ears that are eager to hear you. Give us feet and hands that are eager to follow after you. Bless our time together. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so like Robert said, I'm Brennan Breed. I teach Old Testament, and one of the things I love teaching about the Old Testament is the prophets. Now, if you're a Christian, which I assume most of us are at least, you might know the prophets primarily through, let's say, sermons around Christmas time. Sermons that have to do with foretelling the birth of Jesus. One of the things I'm going to try to help us see today, at least in our time here, is that the prophets primarily were speaking to the people who surrounded them at the moment that they spoke, about things that those people could do at that moment. That is to say, the prophets primarily weren't speaking over the heads of the people around them about events that were hundreds of years in the future. I do think that the prophets at times speak about things that are far in the future, but most of the time, the prophets were talking about what was right in front of them in ways that the people who were alive at that time could understand. They were giving them things that they could do something about. So that's part of what we'll talk about today. So whenever I read the prophets, I try to give some folks a little bit of a historical background and context about what was happening at that exact moment. What is going on in the world? And if I remind us here, the prophets are primarily bearers of the message. They are messengers. This is the function that they played in all ancient societies that we know of in that region of the world, and particularly in Israel as well. But, like I said last night, Israel was distinctive in the way that their prophets functioned in several ways. In all of the other cultures around Israel, all of them had prophets in some way. They called these the same words to talk about these people. They spoke in similar ways to Israel's prophets. It was sort of like a technology, an expectation that the gods, if you're not outside of Israel, there were many gods. That's what people presumed. The Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, these folks assumed that the gods communicated to the people of the world primarily through omens, like this movement of the stars in the sky and so on. But in Israel, they thought that those omens in the sky, that you looked at the stars in the sky to tell you what to do next week or today, primarily you listened for God's voice. And the prophets were people who could hear God's voice clearly and were given the mission of sharing God's voice. What I said was that the prophets that you found in the cultures around ancient Israel were almost all focused on supporting the king, making sure the king was powerful, making sure that the king survived any threats that were coming, and it was really to shore up the power of the state. And the priests also enjoyed sometimes the messages that prophets would bring that would support the temple, support the connection between the temple and the king. So if you were an ancient Babylonian prophet, you primarily spoke about ways to shore up the power of the king and shore up the power of the temple and make sure that everything stayed stable. Because the way that they understood the world was that the state, the temple, the king supported the food coming from the peasants and being given to the gods in the temple for the gods to eat. In the ancient world, people understood the gods to actually eat real food, and they needed real food, and this is why the peasants farmed. In ancient Israel, they have a very different way of thinking about their God, about the temple, and about prophets. Even though all those things are shared with all ancient Eastern cultures. In ancient Israel, they said, God doesn't actually live inside the temple. And God doesn't eat food. God actually likes to smell nice smells when you are roasting meat on the altar. God likes to smell that stuff, but God doesn't eat it. The priests and the people who bring the food, the people eat the food that's brought. But also, the point of the temple isn't to protect the state. God doesn't need the temple for God's own food. God doesn't really need the king of Jerusalem or the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. God doesn't need these people. Instead, what God needs is for the people of Israel to be faithful to the covenant. That's the big story in ancient Israel. The prophets are the people who call Israel and remind them to follow the mission that's laid out in the covenant. And like we said last night, in Genesis 12, Abraham and Sarah are chosen from all the people of the world to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. To restore the blessing that God gave in Genesis 1 that was broken through sin. They're there to help restore this blessing to all the peoples of the earth. And in Exodus 19, after God saved the people from Pharaoh's oppression, God brought them to Sinai, and God said, I'm giving you this covenant, this agreement, this deal, this contract, so that you can be a priestly nation to all the peoples of the world. Mediate God's blessing to all the peoples of the world, to repair the relationship between God and the peoples of the world, and to repair the relationships between people themselves. That is to fix the world. This is the vehicle that God is using to try to fix the world. And we talked about how the covenant was in some ways distinctive because the covenant focused on a few things that were unusual in the ancient world. Primarily, fidelity, loyalty to one God, which is a highly unusual thing to say. And as I mentioned, the idea of making a contract with a God was unusual, but also for a God to speak to a people as a people, y'all. We don't hear of any other God in the ancient world using the word y'all. A second person common plural address. Hey y'all. A God doesn't speak to people like that in the ancient world because that would have been politically dangerous. The gods of ancient Egypt, the gods of ancient Babylon are not reported by priests, by kings to have said y'all to all the people. Kings never said y'all. That is to say, priests never said y'all. The reason that we don't say these things is it was dangerous politically to get the people to start thinking of themselves as a body, a political body, as a family. They were subjects. That was the way the kings talked about them. They were subjects of the king. God relates directly, the God of Israel relates directly to and makes an agreement directly with all of the people together. And the first people in the history of the world that we know of to say, yes, we will, to speak about themselves as a we, like we the people, the first group we know of in the ancient world to do this was Israel in Exodus. They say, yes, we will. The people respond all together. So that is to say, this was an unusual thing. And God, the God of Israel, Yahweh, was demanding loyalty, exclusive loyalty. One of the ways of thinking about covenants in the ancient world was marriage. Marriage was a covenant. And Yahweh continued to say, it's like I'm married to you. Right? So you have to be faithful. You have to be faithful to me and I'll be faithful to you. But you can't go worship other gods then, like your neighbors. You can't worship 10, 20, 30 gods. You can't do that because they're going to tell you to live your life in very different ways. You are faithful to me and the way that I'm setting forward in the covenant for you to live your life. And some of the major principles that we see in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, these big covenantal texts that tell us the laws that God is helping Israel live into, some of the major changes that God makes, let's say, if you compare the laws of ancient Mesopotamia, like Hammurabi's Code, to what we find in Exodus and Deuteronomy, some of that stuff's the same, but some of the major differences are what I call community care. This idea that you have to help your neighbor. That's not in the law codes of ancient Mesopotamia. You have to help your neighbor. Or you have to respect your elders. That's not in a law code in the ancient world. Just like it's not in the code of South Carolina, right? Like, the code of South Carolina does not say you have to be nice to your mom, right? But the Ten Commandments do. But what a judge in South Carolina might say, well, that's for your family to deal with, or that's for your church to deal with. That's for some other body to deal with. That's not law, right? But in ancient Israel, you have to be nice to your mom and dad. You have to be nice to your elders, but also you have to care, especially for the vulnerable. This is not in any law code in the ancient world outside of Israel, to care for widows and orphans, to care for people who don't have someone who cares for them, someone who can stand up and protect them. In the same way, we talked about the invention of the idea of poverty. The first time we hear of poor, this word for the poor, this is ancient Israel's idea. Poverty was not an idea in ancient Babylon. The people who continually didn't have a whole lot of stuff, they were the farmers, and they were the peasants, and that was the point. They didn't have a lot because the king was the one who got all the stuff. This is the way that world was organized, and it was understood that the gods had made it that way. Telling people that they were poor or in poverty so that they could be brought out of it because that was a bad condition, that was not an idea that the king Hammurabi wanted anyone to have. Yeah, I've got a question.
Did they differentiate between people that were poor by their station, or just because they grew up this way, or are they poor because they did something stupid and ended up being poor? They don't differentiate.
I think it covers everyone. That is to say, the word that's used, there's no, so we have a word poor. Israel has to kind of, some of these new ideas that Israel kind of starts to talk about, these ideas aren't found in other cultures around them. There's no word for poor. What Israel does is it takes the word needy, like someone who needs something. But this word, before Israel, was used to describe anyone who needed something. Like you could be very wealthy, but go for a walk in the desert and forget to bring your water, and you need water, you're needy. What Israel does in the laws of Moses is this word starts to get used to talk not just about people who need something now, but people who are in a state of continual need. And the idea that we find in the law of Moses is that this is a bad thing. People who find themselves always needing something. And there's not really a distinction made. I mean, they talk about people who lose their land or money kind of in silly ways. But in the law of Moses, we read several times that there are provisions even for people who make dumb decisions. And every 7 years you're supposed to clear their debt, and every 49 years you're supposed to give everyone's land back. And that was another thing too. In Egypt, Pharaoh owns the land, and you rent the land from Pharaoh. Pharaoh owns all the land. Pharaoh's God's representative of the gods who owns all the gods. In ancient Israel, God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, is said to give a piece of land to every family. It's called an inheritance. Whenever you read the word inheritance in the prophets, it does not mean inheriting grandma's silver or inheriting a piece of land that might be like on the beach and it's a nice place to hang out. No, this is inheriting a piece of farmland so that you could have something you could work to provide for your family in perpetuity. And that's the thing that Yahweh says, you have to make sure everyone has the ability to provide for themselves. And of course, maybe they don't provide for themselves. That's a bad thing. But still, there's this call, hey, you gotta eventually help your neighbor. So like Ruth gleaning on the sides of the fields, right? Wandering people like Ruth are provided for in the law of Moses. They're not mentioned in any other ancient law code. They didn't have rights in any ancient culture. But wandering people like Ruth are told you have to provide for them in some way. You have to leave the edges of your fields so that they can get food for themselves. And this is in that law. That is care for people who are wandering, care for the widows, care for the orphans. And when God gives people these commands, God says, because you knew the life of a wandering person and I saved you. It's because you were a wandering person and I saved you that you have to care for them. It's because you were a vulnerable person like a widow or an orphan when you were in Egypt and you were oppressed, and I saved you then. And my big point there is it's all about grace. The grace that we have been shown, the grace that they were shown, they were asked to return to the world, to return to the people around them, especially those who couldn't provide for themselves. So, that is to say, these three concerns are the core concerns of the ancient prophets. Fidelity to the covenant. Worship Yahweh alone. We hear about idolatry a lot in the prophets. And what they mean is, have you put something in your life that you are worshiping that is taking away your focus from God and from your neighbor in ways that you can live out this mission that you've been given? Anything can fill that role. But in the ancient world, they had gods that they actually worshipped, right? I don't think this is primarily saying, hey, make sure you don't set foot in a synagogue, because that'd be a sin, right? Primarily, idolatry in the prophets is understood as not just praying to a foreign god. It's understood as living your life in such a way that it conforms to the way those gods are understood to have ordered the world. That is to say, God, the God of Israel, is putting forth a different way of life. Worship in the ancient world was about a way of life, not just a ritual act. Except sometimes people back then and today sometimes think that what God's primarily interested in are ritual acts. The prophets have something to say about that. We'll talk about Amos today. Does that help, or is that any questions so far about kind of catching us up on last night and kind of building back up? All right. So if you have your Bibles in front of you, let's turn to Isaiah 20, and we're going to read about the founding of the world's first nudist colony. Not kidding. The point of this is to say the book of Isaiah is almost always used in Christian worship and Bible studies as a way to talk about the birth of Jesus, which I'm going to get to on Sunday in church. I'm going to preach on Isaiah chapter 7, the Emmanuel prophecy. What I want us to think about today is that the book of Isaiah was not primarily written to tell us about the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. That was not the main reason for this book. Isaiah was speaking about events of his day. And when we get to the Emmanuel prophecy, we'll see he's speaking to a king at the time about a battle that's happening at that moment. So, Isaiah chapter 20. In the year that the commander-in-chief, so the general of an army, the general of the Assyrian army, we'll talk about who that is in a minute, but a foreign army, came to Ashdod, which was a city in Philistia, a neighboring country to Israel. So the king of Assyria sent his general to come to the Philistine city, and he fought against it, and he took it. Okay? At that time, the Lord, and whenever you see Lord in all caps, Isaiah chapter 20, verse 2, at that time the Lord in all caps, that's the name Yahweh. Out of reverence, Jews stopped, sometime around the time of Jesus, stopped saying this name out loud. We actually don't know exactly how it was pronounced. Yahweh is kind of a best guess scenario. But I use Yahweh sometimes in Christian settings. I wouldn't say this in a synagogue but I say this in Christian settings because the Lord is a title. It's a hierarchical title that comes from the Middle Ages. Yahweh is a name. It's a personal name of God. And it's set in distinction to other names of other gods, like Baal, or like Dagon, the god of grain of the ancient world. So all the same, Yahweh. Okay, so at that time, Yahweh had spoken to Isaiah, son of Amoz. This one guy, Isaiah, we'll talk about him tomorrow, saying, "Go and loose the sackcloth from your loins," that is your midsection, "and take your sandals off your feet." And he had done so, walking naked and barefoot. So Isaiah walks around the town of Jerusalem naked. Then the Lord said, "Just as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot for 3 years, as a sign and a portent against Egypt and Ethiopia, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptians as captives and the Ethiopians as exile." They're going to be naked. They're going to be taken away. And then verse 5, "They shall be dismayed and confounded because of Ethiopia their hope and of Egypt their boast. And in that day the inhabitants of this coastland will say, 'See, this is what happened to those in whom we hoped, in whom we fled for help and deliverance from the king of Assyria, and oh, how shall we escape?'" Isaiah spends 3 years walking around naked, not because he thinks it's fun. He's probably really embarrassed the whole time. Eventually, I'm guessing he got used to it. It was a sign. And it wasn't a sign about something that was going to happen 700 years later. It was a sign to the generals and to the king about foreign policy. The king of Assyria had the largest army in the world at the time. Assyria is in Mesopotamia today, modern Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. That king brought his giant army over and was killing everyone in the region right around Israel, and had just conquered Philistia, the Philistines, neighboring country to Israel. That king has his army next to Israel and Judah. Jerusalem is right nearby. The king of Jerusalem and his generals are saying, "What are we going to do? Maybe we should make an alliance with Egypt to our south, because they're the second biggest army in this region. And Ethiopia, who's behind them. Maybe both Ethiopia and Egypt would ally with us and would help us survive." There were other peoples in the region who were making some deals with each other, alliances, to try to protect themselves against this foreign power. And Isaiah has a message. His message is, don't you dare make that alliance, that military alliance, because Assyria will win. God has determined it. Yeah.
I was going to say, these are NIV Bibles in here on the table. So there's a couple words that I would love for you to, that are translated slightly differently. So instead of naked, the NIV uses stripped.
Sure.
And instead of Ethiopia, they use Cush.
Sure.
So I guess a few questions. One, the differences between translations for like NRSV and NIV, and then the differences in those words, Cush, Ethiopia, and naked and stripped.
So,
And,
I tend to use NRSV when I
and the NRSV was in the sanctuary last night, so we were all
right.
yeah. But
And NIV's fine, and NRSV's fine.
Right.
So the differences that you see are differences in the human translators that are
Right.
translating these things from Hebrew. The Isaiah's in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, and so folks are making these choices, right? And so naked is the actual word, naked. NIV is using stripped because the point of him being naked is not that he thinks it's fun or whatever. The point is that he is demonstrating to everyone around, if you make an alliance, you will be stripped by these foreign powers, which was literally what they did. They would strip you naked and march you through their towns, whatever, and then they'd let you put clothes on. But it was symbolic of your powerlessness, and you had to be shamefully walked around naked as a captive, and then you would be put to work. So that is to say, Isaiah is saying, this is your future if you follow the path that you're on. And for 3 years, the generals are hemming and hawing, but they finally listen to him, and they don't make an alliance with Assyria, or they don't make an alliance with Egypt. They don't try. But Isaiah says this just saved you. But that's why stripped is trying to get that notion. It's not like naked for the sake of being naked. It's you've been forcefully put into captivity. The Cush, Ethiopia. So Cush is the actual word in Hebrew, and that was the word to describe this territory, which we would associate now with the modern state of Ethiopia and the peoples who live there. So they're the descendants. This was a term. Those folks of Cush, also some of them lived in Arabia, on the Arabian Peninsula.
East African area,
and then Arabia. So, but the Cush was kind of this larger territory. But yeah, those are Ethiopian people. So just to help out with, like, if people don't know what Cush meant back then, the NRSV is putting Ethiopia in there. But all to say, the point of this really is just to say Isaiah is not speaking about spiritual truths that will not come true for 1,000 years. Isaiah is talking to people about something that they can do today. And he's talking primarily about the covenant. Loyalty to the covenant. Be loyal to Yahweh, and Yahweh will be loyal to you. Notice how this is about alliances. It's about the way we're living our lives, and it's about the effects of those things.
So what happened in the 3 years since the generals were discussing all this stuff? These other armies did not march out.
Question is, what happened in those 3 years? What happened in those 3 years is that Judah kind of sat tight. And other countries started to either rebel or try to make alliances with Egypt. And the king of Assyria, ancient kings really only had one army. He just would march it wherever he wanted. He marched kind of around Israel and Judah at that point. Now, later the northern king gets into trouble. Later, the Judah gets into trouble with the Assyrians. Every single thing in the region gets destroyed by the Assyrians except Jerusalem. And we'll get to that story tomorrow. On Sunday, when I preach, I'll preach on Isaiah 7, the Emmanuel prophecy. And the Emmanuel prophecy happens when a foreign army is surrounding Jerusalem, and the king of Jerusalem is looking at Isaiah, and he's saying, are you sure? Are you sure we shouldn't sell out and surrender? So, all to say, that's so this is stuff about kind of political alliances and military stuff and government policy. Isaiah is primarily interested in what's happening in his own day. And for that reason, we got to have a little bit of idea of what's going on in the world around the prophets at that time, kind of what's going on in their newspapers. Because the prophets are primarily not fortune tellers of a distant future in the Bible. They are primarily keen interpreters of what's happening in their own day and age, trying to speak the word of God to a people who can do something with it right then. This is part of my larger idea too, that like God talks to people about things they can do something with. And for the prophets, it's mostly about how they live their lives. So there's 3 different kind of time periods. What you see up here are all the books of the prophets. So there's the major prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and then we got lots of minor prophets, 12 minor prophets. And what you see up here are different prophetic books or parts of prophetic books that speak to these different historical periods that are very different. So what's going on right now in America is quite different than what was going on in 1823 in America. Right? There are some similarities, it's still America, but in 1823, the political situation, the religious situation, the situation of ethics in the country, right? There was a lot of difference between then and today. And in the same way, Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah the prophet, Isaiah ben Amoz, Isaiah who lived in Jerusalem, they live in the same century. And in fact, they live in the same part of the same century. Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah, those 4 prophets are speaking about the same issues. at the same time. Assyria is the mighty power who's threatening to kill everyone. And there were some internal crises that were happening within Israel and Judah that were all similar. And those prophets are giving God's word about similar issues at a similar time. The external crisis of Assyria trying to conquer and the internal crisis of the time, which we'll get to in a minute, are the same. So when you have an idea what's happening in the 8th century BC, that'll help you read Micah, read Isaiah, read Amos, read Hosea, and understand what they're talking about. Because the prophets don't give us all the context of what they're talking about. They kind of expect that the people they're talking to know what's happening. We've lost some of that context, but we can get it back. There's another context, it's the second kind of group of prophets, are prophets who preached during the Babylonian period. Most of these prophets are about 150 years after Amos, Micah, Hosea, and Isaiah. A part of the book of Isaiah speaks about this time, and another part of the book of Isaiah speaks about a little bit later time. That is to say, like they're talking about different events to happen in the future. But let's say the book of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they're about the exile. They're about the Babylonians who are about to destroy Jerusalem. The Babylonians are different people from the Assyrians. It's a different external threat. There's also different internal crises that are happening at the time of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And there's also the crisis of the destruction of Jerusalem and the deportation of the people to a foreign place. That's a very different problem than Amos, Micah, and Isaiah and Hosea were dealing with. So the story of the Babylonian period and of the exile we'll talk about tomorrow morning. And then we have a third group of prophets. Prophets like Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and Joel, who are primarily talking to an audience of people who have returned from exile and have rebuilt their temple. And as you might imagine, they have a very different context. If you're speaking to people who have been displaced and their temple's been destroyed, and then another group of prophets is speaking to people who have just rebuilt their temple, right? We have a different kind of background. So the book of Haggai is pretty easy to understand if you understand this background, although it's happened recently, right around the year 520 is when Haggai prophesied with the rebuilding of the temple. And you might think, oh, they just rebuilt the temple. Must be happy books. Well, they rebuilt the temple, but there are still problems. That is to say, the prophets are always addressing the problems of their own day. So today, we're going to look at Amos and Micah, and I'll talk a little bit about Isaiah. We'll come back to Isaiah on Sunday for the sermon. And tomorrow, I'll talk about this Babylonian period and this Persian period, the exile and the return, and how can we read these prophets. So I'll try to give you some tools about how to read these prophets today. This is a little bit fuzzy, sorry, but this is like a timeline from 800 BC to 700 BC, and you've got Amos and Hosea, which are prophets who speak to the northern kingdom of Samaria. So in the year 922 about, the kingdom of Solomon splits into two. There's a northern kingdom of Israel, or Samaria, or sometimes called Ephraim, and there's a southern kingdom of Judah. And they both worship Yahweh. They both call themselves Israelites. They're connected, obviously, in many ways, but they do have different kings and different temples. So Amos and Hosea are people who speak to the northern kingdom of Israel. And the northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed in 722, and the southern kingdom survives. The southern kingdom has the prophets of Isaiah and Micah during this century. And while Amos probably didn't know Isaiah and Micah definitely know Amos. Amos was like a thunderclap in the history of the world. Whatever he did was so amazing, whatever he said was so shocking, that it was the first prophetic book ever written in the history of the world. No one had ever thought enough about prophets to write down a book of what they had said. No one had ever written a story of a prophet's life before. There had been prophets since at least the year 3000 BC all throughout this region, and they were not considered important enough to write books about. Maybe you'd write the message down, but also even that was considered to be kind of a throwaway. These prophets are not that important. What's really important is reading the stars, and the moon, reading the flight of birds, reading sheep slivers. That's where you get the real message. But something happened with Amos, which starts this tradition in Israel of writing down prophetic books. And then Hosea gets a book, Isaiah gets a book, Micah gets a book, and they continue. And over time, the prophets turn into books. That is to say, prophecy stops at a certain point in Jewish tradition. And what you get instead is books. And then eventually the writing of books stops. At least the writing of new sacred books stops, and the interpretation of the books becomes the core of the religion. And the prophets are essential in understanding this transition from a people of the spoken word and ritual to a people of a book. When we say, like, this is the primary way we engage with God, it's really a story that we have to look to the prophets to help us understand. So we'll get to that tomorrow. So one of the things I'll mention today is that these kingdoms of Assyria and Babylon and later Persia, the dominant powers of the day, loom large in these books. They aren't always mentioned by name, but they are shaping the world around Israel in ways that Israel can't escape. The table is set by Assyria, like you read with Isaiah in chapter 20. Everything in the book of Isaiah is pervaded by this crisis of the Assyrians. Tomorrow we'll hear about the crisis of the Babylonians, which is a different kind of crisis. All right, one other thing to jump into before we get into our text, and that is, what in the world was happening in the 8th century BC that made people begin to write prophetic books? And why do we get this huge group of prophets that speak to this century, and everyone started to write down what they were saying, whereas the century before that, we didn't get books about prophets. We have some collected stories of Elijah and Elisha, but they didn't get their own books. What was it about this century that God began to speak through prophets very clearly? So, here we go. To tell this story that starts in the year 800, I got to back up a bit. I got to back up a bit to what we call the Late Bronze Age. In the Late Bronze Age, Israel was a group of enslaved people who were in Egypt. So when we start our story here, Egypt is where Moses is, right? This is around the time of Moses and Aaron. They're enslaved peoples in Egypt. Who was living in what we now call Israel? The Canaanites. These were people who today we might think of them as being identical to Phoenician people. Phoenike means purple in Greek, and Canaan means purple in Canaanite, the local language of the people. Why were they purple people? Because they had the Murex snail. They had this snail that was purple, and if you crushed it up, you could make a purple dye. And why was purple dye important? Because it's so rare in the natural world. It's a color that almost doesn't exist in the natural world. So if you can make purple cloth, it's really rare, and that's why it was the color of kings. That's why it was illegal in Rome. Rome liked to think they didn't have kings, at least for a while. It was illegal for anyone to wear purple in Rome for a long time, when it was a democracy, or it was a republic. So all to say, the basic idea of this time period back here is, all these folks are culturally similar. They're Canaanites or Phoenicians, same thing. They are peoples who speak a language that's a lot like Hebrew today. In fact, if you can read Hebrew, you can read ancient Canaanite. It's a dialect of the same kind of thing. It's the language of that land. But these folk were dominated politically by Egypt. So Egypt owns this region. What's now Israel, right? Egypt owned that region. And Egypt dominated this region through city-states that were run by local people, but that Egypt took taxes from. So Egypt propped up local kings in cities you might have heard, like Shechem or Jerusalem. Right? Jerusalem is a Canaanite city. It was around for thousands of years before King David. And it was run by local Canaanite people. They called themselves Jebusites, the people who lived in this area. But they were Canaanite folk. And they were run in a way by Egypt. Egypt sent soldiers around to make sure that the local people followed this local king. But they propped up a local king, and they took lots of taxes from the local king. And the little territories here, the little lines, this is just to show you they had city-states. So the Egyptians told the king of Shechem, you got to take the taxes from this portion, this area. We're going to give you this big chunk of land, and you got to take the taxes from these folk, and you got to send half of it down to us in Egypt. And if they didn't do it, they'd send their army up there and take the money, right? Okay, these city-states had large buildings, but very few people lived in them, right? The city-states were tiny little areas, tiny things, and some soldiers lived there, some priests lived there, and a king or a local ruler lived there. There were palatial estates, really. This is Hatzor, which became an Israelite city, but was a Canaanite city for thousands of years before that. And this is the layer of Late Bronze Age Hatzor, a tiny little thing. It's real small, but here's a gate and a big wall to keep you out. Here's a temple complex, and there's a royal complex. And they probably had some garrisons for soldiers around. Very few people live in this city. It's not a city like we think of it. It's just a big fortress. It's a big fortified palace. And where did the money come from? Where did the food come from to feed and support the soldiers and the temple staff and the king? came from the local peasants, right? That is to say, the local farmers brought their food, and how did they bring their taxes? In tithe to the temple. You'd bring your tithes to the temple, and it wasn't just 1/10. They often brought more than half of their food. They would show up with all their food, and then they would take half of it and take it back for themselves, and they would leave the rest for the local lords. Some of the local food would feed the local folks who were running the administrating these areas. The rest of it would be sent to Egypt. So this is how that structure worked. And these giant palaces would be lived in by like one family, right? This is a royal palace in Hatzor. And wherever you dig up things in ancient Israel, wherever there's Bronze Age structures, you'll find somewhere around there this big palace. And this is the way that the gods were understood to want this to happen. Baal. Baal is the god of fertility, of rains, and of growing of crops. And Baal is the one who makes the world make crops, according to this ancient Canaanite religion, so that the peasants can grow it, so that the peasants can farm it, and bring it and feed Baal. This is how Baal wants the world to look. Yeah, question?
You might want to touch upon the importance of the Bronze Age, so to say.
You mean bronze itself?
The bronze
Yeah,
itself.
so it's called bronze, and then the later age is called iron. Israel emerges during the Iron Age. This is the idea that like we're measuring time by what kind of tools people use. People used bronze tools in the Bronze Age, which is not as strong as iron, but they hadn't figured out how to make iron last, how to shape it, but also how to you had to kind of you had to fortify it with other kinds of metals in order to make it actually last and work. So that is to say, eventually people figure out how to take iron and turn it into tools. It takes a while, and in the meantime they're using bronze. So the Bronze Age is this time period, long time period, thousands of years, when folks were using those kinds of tools. But we associate this with the age of the Canaanites when we're thinking about ancient Israel. So something happens right around the year 1200 BC. The world falls apart. There was a climactic disruption of some kind. We're not exactly sure, but archaeobotanists, people who dig down and find ancient seeds and remains of plants and test them for certain, they could tell that there was a massive drought at this time, all throughout the Mediterranean world. Something happened. We're not exactly sure what, but all giant cultures collapse because they run out of food and water. And the cities that people had lived in, people flee those cities because there's not enough food. You can't import food anymore to run them. So people flee. At this time, people are moving all around this part of the world, including Israel. This is the point in time where Israel ends up settling in what is now understood to be the region of Israel. Folks in one of the Greek islands that today we would call Turkey, but this was inhabited by Greek folks at the time. They get in their boats because they run out of food and water, and they end up kind of coming over to Crete, and they end up coming over to Egypt and trying to settle there. They're rejected. They end up coming over to the area of now the Gaza Strip. They settle there. This is the Philistines. The Greek people who ran out of water and food and then found a new home. And they were brought there. I'll mention this. Amos has something to say about this, so we'll get back to that. So keep that in mind. The Philistines are people who came from somewhere else and settled in this region. At the same time, Egypt falls apart. Politically, economically, militarily, and this is the time that's associated with the flight of Israel and with their deliverance into the land of Canaan. Meanwhile, the land of Canaan is falling apart. Those city-states I told you about, they're running out of food and water. Some of them survive, like Jerusalem, but many of them fall apart. We can tell because the cities just kind of are abandoned. Archaeologically, like there's no destruction, there's no fire, there's just people left their cities and went to places where they thought they could find food, where there weren't quite as many people around. So this is a time of intense disruption. Egypt falls apart. The Hittite Empire, which was here, they fall apart. They never come back again. The empires like Hammurabi of Babylon and Assyria collapse. And there is a power vacuum that emerges all throughout this region. And in that power vacuum, new states form, like Philistia, the Philistines, like Israel, and then later Judah, like the Moabites, and the Edomites, and the Syrians, or the Arameans, same people. All these local states form right around the year 1200. And amazingly, some people start to, for the first time in the history of the world, use alphabetic script. Before that, people had used syllabaries, kind of like a very difficult thing to learn with like thousands of signs of different syllables and some syllables that just stood for words, kind of like Mandarin Chinese, like very difficult for people to learn. some people in this part of the world began to use alphabetic script that anyone could learn, that peasants could learn how to read and write for the first time. And they began to write for the first time in the history of the world their local spoken language in these new alphabetic scripts. Before that, people wrote in a language that no one spoke. It was like cultural high forms of languages. The hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt, no one spoke that language. It was like a ritual language that was not the language of the street. But people around Israel start to write in their local languages for the first time, in local scripts. So there's this kind of, it's a collapse, but it's also a time of kind of birth and generation of new peoples. And something happens in the hill country that we now think of as Judah and Samaria. We get 250 new settlements that pop up right around the year 1200 BC. And these new settlements look unlike anything that Canaan had ever seen before. Here's a little topographical map just to show you these highland areas. And let me ask you, so this is a Presbyterian church associated at least historically with some Scotch-Irish people. And why did the Scotch-Irish end up mostly settling in Appalachia? Did they like the mountains? No. The Scotch-Irish people got pushed in many ways to Appalachia because they were poor and weak. Why did poor and weak people get pushed into the mountains? Because it's not easy to farm. It's really hard to farm if you're in West Virginia. The people who ended up in West Virginia and hill parts of Kentucky and so on, they were forced, that was what was left. They got the leftovers. And what ancient Israel was at the beginning were leftover people. Think of the story of Gideon. Gideon is like harassed by the Midianites who are stronger and bigger than him, and he's like hiding out in his little house trying to like sort through his grain because he's getting stolen all the time. The Israelites were folks who lived in the hills and were not terribly strong, according to the book of Judges. Now, these 250 new villages that pop up at the exact same time, looks like a settlement of a land, right? They generally are settled in places where no one had ever lived before. Even in the Stone Age, there were no settlements underneath. This is new places for people to live. And they generally lived in these small communities, and they invented a new kind of architecture, the 4-room house. No one had ever had this kind of house before, but they started to build in this style all throughout this area, in the hill country there, in Israel and Judah. And what they build are these houses where basically people can share economic resources in a way. You can keep all your animals in this one part on the bottom floor, and you can kind of keep your farming implements around, and several families can kind of live together in this one area, and it's kind of a self-sustaining house farm. They start to build these house farm communities. They also have this distinctive kind of pottery in which they have no decorations on it. Now, it's actually easy to decorate pottery in the ancient world. You just kind of like put your finger on it and draw some lines. They don't touch this stuff. And in part, people who study this say there's only one reason they would do this, is because they intentionally wanted to reject ornamentation. It's kind of strange. And here's an eagle-eye view of one of these communities, Isbet Sarta. In 1200 BC, people built these houses in a little circle. So it's kind of like defensive, but also probably for your animals to keep your sheep in. This is not a big settlement. It's like 20 families. Where does the king live here? Where's the temple? Yeah, we don't find any temples in these. We don't find any like clearly religious establishments here. We don't find any houses that are like tons bigger than any other house. We don't find luxury goods. And when you do find some luxury goods, they're distributed throughout the houses. And these little circles here, these are called grain pits. I'll come back to these in a moment. This is where the community would put their grain and they cover them over so they could have the grain for the rest of the year. This is Beersheba, which is in the south. It's in Judah. And this is what Beersheba looked like about the year 1200 BC. These little communities, small farming communities in which people were self-sufficient, in which people farmed lots of different things all at the same time, and seemed to live together in a community that was egalitarian. This was totally unheard of. Canaan had never seen a settlement like this ever. And the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world is in this region. It's in Jericho. And the very first part of Jericho that was built, right around year 7000 BC, again, oldest inhabited city in the world. The bottom layer of it is a giant palace. This is bizarre. And 250 of these things pop up all at the same time, almost like these people were part of a family or some sort of community that understood and had a shared ethos, some sort of shared commitment to each other. Here's a little artist's kind of reconstruction of what this might have felt like to folks. We're all kind of doing this stuff together. Well, things change. This is Betsarta, that same community I showed you, that little circle community, right around the year 1200 BC. This is when Israel emerges as a people. Well, around the year 1000 BC, that's the rise of David. The rise of Saul and then David. When Saul becomes king in 1 Samuel 15, it's almost comical because Saul is out in the field plowing. He's king. And someone has to go find him and he's out plowing in the field. It's almost like a joke. Like the king is plowing in the field. But for early Israel, the idea was that a king didn't mean you got to live in better than anyone else. You didn't get to take from people. But over time, ancient Israel begins to adopt the ways of the kings that surround them. And they build a massive temple like the peoples around them. They build a massive palace for David. And then Solomon builds an even more massive palace. Then Solomon builds lots of palaces for them. Solomon is really rich. I have a question of, where does Solomon get that money from? Some of it's from trading with foreigners, but where does Solomon get most of his money from? From the people. And the Bible tells us that this was a big problem because the reason that the kingdom splits into two, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, is that the people of the northern kingdom say, we are tired of your taxation, which we don't see any benefit from, and you conscript our labor. The guy who becomes the new king of the northern kingdom to reject Solomon, and Rehoboam, Solomon's son, was the guy who Solomon had put over forced labor. Forced labor. They forced their own people to work 4 months out of the year to build new palaces for the king. Would that make you mad? Who's caring for your field when you're spending 4 months building stuff for the king? Right? That is to say, the people of the northern kingdom of Israel, they split literally because of the issue of forced labor. Now, 1200 BC is Betsarta, which is in the north, it's in the northern part of Israel, was this little egalitarian community. 900 BC, the kings had just come onto the scene. You got a giant palatial estate, a couple other houses around, and they've unbuilt their community. And then by 800 BC, you just got one house. And now you've got grain pits spread over this huge, at first you got it kind of isolated here, but lots of grain pits. Like you have this, actually if you look in the kind of region around this palatial estate, you have a 700% increase in grain production. But you went down from 30 houses to 1. There are no other permanent inhabitations that can be found around that palatial estate. Where did all the farmers live? Well, now they live in buildings that were built with materials that couldn't survive the test of time, like stone, because they didn't have time to build their stone houses anymore because they were helping the king, spending the rest of their time trying to eke out a survival. What the kings end up doing as well is forcing people to produce one kind of product, whatever they were best at. You're a sheep herding region, everyone has to pay their taxes in sheep. We actually hear about this in the book of Chronicles, makes a big deal about it. King Uzziah is one of these people who's like, yeah, you gotta like pay all your taxes in sheep. And you know what that does? It specializes people so that it increases the production of the whole nation. That's wonderful, right? Except, let's say you're a sheep farmer. Now what do you have to do? You have tons of wool? Like, where's my food? Now you have to start trading for food. And when you trade for food now, you're losing some money on this and that, and you're trying to figure out how to work in a trading economy. That is to say, you have to barter for certain things now, and there are certain people, merchants, who come along and take advantage of these rubes that don't know how to trade for stuff, and you have a crisis, a huge economic crisis that begins. Let's say you're a barley farmer. They say this part of the country is good for barley, which we make beer out of. Okay, you got to pay all your taxes in barley, which means you got to focus everything on barley. Okay, now you become a barley farmer. Let's say you have a bad year for barley. You have no money. You still owe your taxes. Where are you going to get the money from? There's no beer. Yeah. So the king still wants what it is. What do you have to do? You have to sell your kids. You can sell your kids or you can sell your land. Those are your two options. You sell your kids before you sell your land, because if you sell your land, you're not getting your kids back. So first you sell your kids. You hope that the next year is better so that you have a little bit of excess so that you can buy your kids back. Let's say the second year's bad. Then you sell your land. And then you finally sell yourself. Israel became a nation of debt slavery. The majority of people in Israel at this time were likely enslaved. That's why they don't have houses. Imagine that you're a prophet. And this is what God told you to do in the covenant. But this is what you see around you. And it became like this just because certain people wanted to use people around them to their own advantage. So here's Beersheba in the south, in Judah. This is Beersheba around the year 1200. This is Beersheba in the year 800, much bigger city. The folks who lived here, these were the garrisons. This is the administrative district, and this is the kind of priestly area folks. The peasants don't live here, right? The peasants live outside this, but they built it. That is to say, they built the walls. This is a giant reservoir so you can withstand a siege, right? They built that stuff, and then they had to build them outside of this new area that was just built. We're going to come back to Micah of Morsheth, who was a guy who lived in the city, and then had to build it into a new city for the king, and then had to leave.
What was their threat at that time of other?
At 800 BC? Yeah. So in the year 800 BC, it was the Arameans. The Arameans were folks who were like invading, and generally we read about these wars in the Book of Kings between the Arameans and the Israelites in Judah. That was their major rival at the time, but also the Philistines. They were still fighting against the Philistines in the year 800 BC. So they got these kind of like power struggles in the region. Starting in the year 750 BC, it's the Assyrians. And we'll get to that in a minute. Another thing is...
Brendan, we had a question right
here.
here.
Question.
I have to ask you, there's so many different sects of people.
Yeah.
All those different names.
Oh, yeah.
When you look at Europe, in that area, it's not a lot of space
Right.
for these tribes. How did they come up with their names? I never understood it, because I understand it because it's so overwhelming.
Yeah, great question. How did they come by their names? For a lot of them, they were names of an eponymous ancestor. Eponymous meaning he was named after. So Jacob or Israel, you get the name Israel. Often these names have something to do with God.
There's that many gods.
Oh yeah. They had thousands of gods in this region, and each little group of folks had their own local gods. Even clans had their own gods. Even industries had their own gods. There's the god of the leather workers. There's the god of the and there was your household god. There were like literally gods of just your local family, like 10 people, you know. And so Rachel, remember, steals these household gods, these idols, from Laban, and those were like Laban's family's gods. Yeah.
So I'm wondering how many different sects, I don't think that's the right word, of people, sects.
Well, we don't know exactly, but what's left behind, yeah, it's crazy. There's all these different tribes and so on. But okay, so the point is that in ancient Israel, you had this reduction in the quality of life for most people. But we also see the development of giant palaces. We see David's palace built in Jerusalem. We see here, this is Samaria today, Samarina is the name of the city. It's in the West Bank. If you're over there, you can go up this beautiful place on top of this hill that King Omri built this giant city. And here's King Omri's palace. Of course, it's in ruins now, but he had this giant palace full of ivory. He built the ivory house. Oh, thank you. So there's ivory that was found at that site, but also was found after the Assyrians destroyed the capital of Samaria. They steal a lot of the ivory. We know it comes from Samaria though, because it's actually like genetically identical to the ivory we found in situ. So that is to say, the Assyrians stole this stuff, but they had all these carved ivory objects, luxury objects. I got a question for you. How much wool, raw wool, do you think you have to trade for a giant tusk of ivory in the year 800 BC? 1 pound? 2? No. I mean, enormous amounts of this stuff. Where's that coming from to get these luxury goods? To pay art, it's coming from the peasants. And every year the kings would demand more and more and more so that they could fill their palaces with this ivory stuff. And a lot of this ivory stuff ends up being made by Egyptian or Phoenician, who are in the Egyptian style, making this stuff about their own local gods. So here you've got a kind of a depiction of like Pharaoh, like in a sphinx form. Like this is in the palace of the northern king. So if you're a prophet, you walk in the northern king's palace, you see people's livelihoods on the walls in the form of ivory and pictures of foreign gods on there. Because to them, it's the same thing. This is all idolatry. It's not about praying to Zeus or something, right? This is about the way you're living. Primarily about the way you're living. It's all tied up together. All these, the great ivory house in Samaria was Omri's house. And here's an image that was found in Samaria. This is the birth of Hathor, the Egyptian king. Right? He's living like a pharaoh because he wants to be Pharaoh, the king of Israel. And remember Solomon? Remember who he married? It was a real big deal. Pharaoh's daughter. Made an alliance with Egypt and married Pharaoh's daughter. And this is part of the story where Solomon starts to become a bad guy. Because he starts to want too much. Starts to get too big for his britches. In the law in Deuteronomy, the king is mentioned one time, and there's one job given to the king. Don't acquire anything. Deuteronomy 17, the king is in charge of the army, the king's not in charge of the judicial system, the king's not in charge of anything, the elders are in charge of all that. It's distributed power. But the king is in charge of reading the Torah every day and making sure you don't acquire any stuff. Obviously, Solomon didn't read that part, right? Here's an ivory bed from Samaria. Imagine how much money it takes to buy an ivory bed, right? And the rich folks who would live in these big cities would often have these parties. The name that's associated with these in the ancient world is the Marziach feast. This was done from Babylon, from Persia, all the way to Egypt. Canaan did this, and Israelites did this from time to time. They would have a giant party, and I'm sorry, this is kind of gross, but they would drink and eat so much, like they would especially drink so much alcohol. This is King Cyrus's giant bowl where he would just drink wine until he got sick in public. They would have a party in public, and they would get sick in public so that other people could see how powerful they were. I have so much wine, I can drink so much that I can throw it up in front of you. Right, and here is an image from a tomb of an Egyptian queen, showing, this is a picture she put on her tomb to be with her forever, to show how powerful she was. Here's her. Not kidding, because this was seen as a cool thing. The prophets talk about drinking alcohol sometimes. They are not against alcohol in general. Everyone in the ancient world drank beer and wine. They all did, because otherwise much of the water was not potable. So they drank beer and wine because it was fermented and it was safe for them to drink. But the prophets are against this kind of thing. They do not like these public displays of drunkenness because, not just because being drunk is bad, but because it's about actually showing people how powerful you were. And this poor woman, this servant who has to clean this up, she was sold into slavery because her dad couldn't make the payments on his vineyard. That's her life. It's being vomited out in front of her.
Where do all these artifacts and everything end up today? What country are you from?
This one's in Egypt. This is in Luxor. This is from the tombs in Luxor. You can see it today. Yeah. But I mean, so these are kind of from all over. But this one right here, this is some of these luxury goods that some people would acquire, right? It takes a lot of grain to get this, right? This one's actually from Persia. But so, there are like luxury objects you can find, throughout these elite sites. Yeah.
You read started in Isaiah 20, the pros, Egypt, warning about those people.
That's right.
And then you go over and see the poem in chapter 30. So my question is this: who put all? In other words, it's like I'm making the commentary and then I start singing.
The singing stuff. Great question. So the singing stuff is generally from the prophet. So the prophet is singing the singing stuff. The prophets generally spoke in poetry, in part because poetry was associated with the divine world. Like we sing hymns. Why do we sing hymns? Because the poetry, the beauty of the words, the beauty of the music elevates our speech in a way, lifting it up to God. And in a way, the prophets are trying to get people to get out of the kind of confines of their mind and of their day. And so the poetry is generally from the prophets, yeah.
Yeah, unless you had somebody sitting next to you, maybe like a Baruch and Jeremiah.
Yes.
Who wrote these things down? I mean, these are beautiful literary works.
Excellent question. I'll get to that tomorrow morning. I'll talk more about good. I'll talk more about the production of these as literary techniques and literary constructs tomorrow. But okay, so in any event, as I said, Assyria is the main external crisis at the moment, and the kings and generals have a problem. That problem is that Assyria, which for a long time has been kind of relegated to their part of the world, their kingdom fell apart during the Bronze Age collapse, but now they've been able to reacquire power in the region, and they're starting to march to the coast. Why does Assyria want to march to the coast? Well, this is all desert in here. But this, because the Tigris and Euphrates has a lot of place to grow crops. Like they can build canals, and they can fertilize a ton of the land, and they can grow lots of food. But they don't have iron, they don't have mineral deposits. Iraq is down a lot of mountains. They have no mineral deposits, and they don't have big trees. Remember where the big trees were in the ancient world? The cedars of Lebanon, right next to Israel. So the king of Syria wants primarily trees to build big buildings for himself, and he wants minerals or metals, precious minerals like copper and bronze, but also some things like iron that he needs to make his army stronger. So he wants to explain. He also wants the trading that comes from the Phoenician people. The Phoenicians are the best seafaring traders in the ancient world. So he wants to conquer them and make them trade for him. So he sees this as a business opportunity. So the king of Assyria wants to own all this territory. He doesn't primarily care about Israel and Judah. They're the hill people. He wants the coastland, and he wants the people living in Lebanon, which are not Israel and Judah. But Israel and Judah, he kind of wants to conquer them too, just to like suppress any possibility for them conquering him or hurting him in some way. So they're kind of ancillary to his plans. This guy, Tiglath-Pileser III, he shows up in the Bible as Pul. That's his name in the Bible, Pul. He's mentioned a bunch in the Book of Kings. Because this guy is the guy who takes Assyria, turns it into the world's largest war machine, turns it into a ferocious bunch of sadists who love to torture people publicly and marches them towards the coastline. This is terrifying for all the people of Israel and Judah. And all the people of the region, including the Arameans or the Syrians, same people, go to Damascus, and the people of Moab, the people of Ammon, the people of Philistia, all these neighboring countries to Israel and Judah, they start to try to figure out how do we survive. But in 750, right before Tiglath-Pileser starts to march his army towards the coast, everything in Judah, to the elite, looked like it had never been better. There was more precious goods coming in. It looked like the economy was doing better because the palaces were bigger than they'd ever been before. The armies of Israel and Judah were more powerful than they'd ever been. They didn't have very many external enemies. They had suppressed Aram and Philistia. Things looked great. Never looked better. Within 20 years, the northern kingdom of Israel is totally gone. It's their high point in strength and power and wealth. And in 20 years, they're totally gone off the map. And right at that pivot point, there's a guy named Amos who stands up and says, God told me that y'all are going down unless you change. So right at this moment where things start to go down and down and down and down and down, and ending in the exile of Judah, we're going to be talking about this kind of downward slope. And the prophets are these people who are standing at the top of the slope saying, turn around, things can change. But you have to try. God wants you to change.
Brendan, are Amos and Micah, they're riding to the north. Are they located in the north, or are they in the south riding to the north?
Amos is a southerner. We'll see
Right.
in just a minute. We'll get to the turn of Amos now. But Amos is a southerner who's speaking to the northern kingdom.
Okay.
Hosea is a northerner speaking to the northern kingdom.
Yep.
Micah and Isaiah are southerners speaking to the southern kingdom. So they're all a little different. But we'll start with Amos here. So if you turn to the book of Amos, which is in the book of the 12, the minor prophets, if you open your Bible to the middle, you might be like in Job, Psalms, and so on. Keep turning. If you get to Isaiah, keep going. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, keep going. And then you'll get a little book of Daniel, right? Then you'll get to 12. So Hosea, and then Joel, and then Amos is the third book in the 12. Has anyone got the page number of the beginning of the book of Amos in these Bibles on the table? 14 would be great. Okay, so whenever you read a prophetic book, keep two things in mind. Number one, the beginning of the book, all of them except for Jonah, have what's called a superscription. That is, a later editor came and told us a little bit about the context. When was this spoken and to who? And that's the superscription you see there in chapter 1, verse 1. The second thing to keep in mind is that the prophets did not say all these things in a row. The prophets spoke in oracles, a message that God gave. And generally, an oracle would start with a messenger formula, what messengers would say when they would arrive with a message, which is, thus says X. X being whoever sent the message. Thus says King David. And they would usually close their message by saying, thus says King David. And the editors of your Bibles have probably organized these oracles and separated them a little bit. So each oracle gets its own space. And the point being that each oracles might go together in kind of like larger chunks, but you can kind of look at them as individual works of art. So if you turn to Amos chapter 5, you might see that chapter 5, verse 1 and 2 are separated from verse 3. Is that true in your Bible? In whatever Bible you got? There's a little bit of white space in between verse 2 and 3. That's because chapter 5, verse 1 and 2 are an oracle. They were spoken together. Chapter 5, verse 3 is a separate oracle. It might have been spoken on a different day, in a different place, to a different group of people. We actually don't know. We've lost some of that context. But, so you can read verse 3 by itself. Amos spoke that, and then left, went somewhere else. Chapter 5, verse 4 and 5, that's an individual oracle. We'll come back to these in a minute, but just to say, when you read the prophets, you don't have to make sense of all of it all the way through in a row. Look at each oracle individually and try to make sense of that oracle. And then try to think about this larger context into which the prophet is speaking. And that'll usually help make sense of it. So let's go back to Amos 1:1. Amos chapter 1, verse 1. It says, the words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa. We're going to turn in a minute and read a little bit more about the story of Amos. Tekoa is a town, it's a little south of Jerusalem. So it's a small rural community outside of Jerusalem. The words of Amos, which he saw, got words and we got seeing something. Amos sees visions in chapter 7 through 9. Concerning Israel in the days of King Uzziah of Judah, and in the days of King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. So Amos spoke. Apparently, all of his message came within a year, because he spoke 2 years before the earthquake. Not between 2 and 4 years before the earthquake. So Amos, all of his message came within a year. The second thing is that there was an earthquake not long after Amos spoke. And one of the things Amos said is verse 2. Amos said, the Lord, Yahweh, roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds wither, and the top of Mount Carmel dries up. So God is going to roar, and there will be a natural disaster. That's one thing Amos said. And then there was an earthquake. And people said, ooh, maybe we should remember what that guy said. And that might be where the book of Amos comes from. That is, Amos was right. So, where else did the book of Amos come from? I think it was written down by spies. All right, chapter 7. Turn to chapter 7, verse 10. We get one story about Amos. One and only one story, and that's this. Chapter 7, verses 10 through 17. We get lots of stories about other prophets. But Amos is the first prophet. They hadn't yet got the art of writing the stories of the prophets down yet. But they get this. Okay, it says, then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel. All right, Bethel is in the northern kingdom of Israel. It's not far from Jerusalem, so it's over the border. And it's the royal chapel. The king made this the center of worship for the northern kingdom. Also Dan, city in the far north. But Bethel was the much bigger worship center. This is the royal chapel. Think like the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Okay. Amaziah is the priest of this royal temple, the center of royal worship power, right? And he sends to King Jeroboam of Israel, who lives in Samaria, up the road a little bit. So the priest sends a message to the king, and he says, Amos has conspired against you in the very center of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words. The people are freaking out because Amos has said something, and it's a conspiracy. He has conspired against you. It's treason. Amos is fomenting treason. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam the king shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from his land. Do you see why that's treason? The prophet is saying the king is going to die, and the kingdom will fall, and we will be taken away. Now, just before that, Amos says that. If you look up a little bit at chapter 7, verse 9, this is Amos's prophecy. Amos is saying, the high places of Isaac, he's using Isaac to mean the northern kingdom of Israel. The high places of our country shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste, like the temple at Bethel. Everything's going to get knocked down. And I, God speaking, will rise against the house of Jeroboam with a sword. God is going to take down the kingdom of Jeroboam, and Jeroboam's going to die, and God is the one who's behind it. God is unbuilding the kingdom. Now, why? We'll get to that in a minute. But notice that the priest wrote that down. He's sending a message to the king, Jeroboam, and he's written down what Amos said, and he's sending it as evidence. Amaziah said to Amos, so Amaziah then asks for a meeting with Amos, and he says, O seer, that is visionary, O visionary one, go flee away to the land of Judah, earn your bread there and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary. It's the temple of the kingdom. This is treason. And then Amos answered Amaziah. He said, I'm not a prophet. Wait, what? I thought Amos was a prophet. I thought he's in the book of the prophets. He says, I'm not a prophet. I'm not a prophet's son. In other words, he is a prophet. But what he's saying is, I'm not like those prophets. There were lots of prophets who existed, just like in all the peoples around him, in Mesopotamia and Egypt, who told the king what the king wanted to hear. In the book of Kings, we could read lots of stories about these prophets who tell the kings whatever they want to hear. And he said, I'm not like that. I'm not a spy from the southern kingdom who's trying to foment rebellion here. No, I am not really a prophet like that. I'm not doing this for money, and I'm not doing this for power. He says, I am a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. In other words, I'm a factory farmer. He actually is someone who owns a farm. He's not a shepherd like a poor little shepherd boy. When it said he's a shepherd of Tekoa, it means he's the one who owns the giant sheep farms. He employs a lot of little shepherd boys. But so he's actually a powerful guy. But he says, and Yahweh took me from following the flock, from doing my job, and Yahweh said to me, go prophesy to my people Israel. He says, I'm not a prophet who's doing this for money. I wasn't raised in this job. God told me to go and tell you this. So I can't stop, even if you call it conspiracy. And then he says, now therefore, you say don't prophesy, but you know what? You're going to die, and your family's going to get taken away. And it's not that God is doing this to be happy, or God wants to do this. It's that this is what happens when foreign powers come and kill you. The foreign power is coming. You have a chance to change. Everything can change. But if you are dead set on your ways, the king of Assyria will come and take you. So that's the story, really, of Amos. Now, if you turn back to chapter 1, here's Amos's big statement here. Imagine a festival day. Everyone's coming to the temple of Bethel. A big feast, right? People are streaming into the temple. Think about Easter Sunday, National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Thousands of people coming in to fill the pews, wearing their Sunday finest from all over. And chapter 1, verse 3, Amos says, thus says Yahweh. Imagine him up there yelling at all sorts of people. He says, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment. Where is Damascus? Syria. The Syrians. God says, I am going to get the Syrians. Your neighbors to the north you've been fighting with for a long time, God says, I'm going to get them. Why is God going to get them? Because they have threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron. Oh, sorry. The map. I got it. There you go. All right. So here's a little map. Gilead is this area that Israelites lived in, but it was just beneath Syria or Damascus. And the people of Syria, Damascus, the Arameans, all the same people, they attacked Gilead and took part of it and killed a bunch of people, a bunch of innocent people in the meantime. Amos says that God is judging the people of Damascus for hurting Israelites. And what do you think the people of Israel said? Yes. My cousin was there and got hurt. Yes. God's finally going to give the Arameans, those Syrians, what they deserve. Because they killed innocent people in Gilead. My kin. All right. God says, I'm going to break the bars of Damascus. I'm going to send a fire on the house of the king there. God's going to burn Damascus to the ground. Yay! All right. Then verse 6, Amos says, thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4 I will not revoke punishment, because they carried into exile entire communities to hand them over to Edom. Some people in Israel were conquered by a part of Gaza, an ancient Philistine city, and they took those people and they sold them into slavery in Edom. Innocent people, they captured them, they sold them in slavery, right? It's a war crime. God is going to judge them for this. And the people of the northern kingdom of Israel at Bethel, they said, yes, finally, God's going to give them what they deserve. Those people, they should have known better. Mess with us. God's got our back. Yahweh loves us. God says, I'm going to send a fire on the walls of Gaza. I'm going to knock down Gaza because of what they did against you. Verse 9, thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Tyre. Anyone know where Tyre is? Tyre and Sidon were 2 major cities. So they're in the north here, they're in Phoenicia. So I'll kind of jump up here for a second. Okay. So here's Syria, Damascus. Here's Philistia down here. And then up here, that's Tyre. The Phoenicians live up here, Lebanon today. So the Syrians, the Gazans, the Lebanese, they're messing with you. God says, and I'm going to come and judge them. For 3 transgressions of Tyre, even for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they delivered entire communities over to Edom. Philistia conquered those areas, sold people, Israelites, in slavery to Edom, and the Phoenicians were the ones who brokered the deal. They were the traders who took the enslaved people and sold them. Your kin. They took your kin and enslaved them and sold them. And you know what? God says, I'm going to get them. I'm going to knock down their kingdom in punishment for what they did. Because they did not remember the covenant of kinship. The Phoenicians were supposed to be kind of kin, like cousins with the Israelites. They broke their friendship. Remember, the king of Tyre is the one who builds the temple for Solomon, his friend? Yeah, they broke that covenant. So I will send a fire on the wall of Tyre and devour its strongholds. And the people of Bethel said, yes, finally, this guy is going to tell us that God is finally going to fix this. God's going to end those people. And then verse 11, thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4 I will not revoke punishment. Edom's down here. So we got Syrians, the Philistines, the Philistines, the Phoenicians, the Edomites. We're going to get to Moab in just a minute. God's going to get these people. For the 3 transgressions of the Ammonites, God's going to get them, right? For the 3 transgressions of Edom. So verse 11, for 3 transgressions of Edom, even for 4 I won't revoke punishment, because Edom pursued his brother with the sword and cast off all pity, maintained his anger. Edom was the place that was associated with Esau, the brother of Jacob. Our brothers, our kinfolk, killed some of us, attacked us. And so for that, God's going to get them. And the people of Bethel said, yes, finally, God's going to get them. Then, for 3 transgressions of the Ammonites, right here, these folks, I'm going to get them too, God says. Amos is telling everyone, I'm going to get them too, because they have ripped open pregnant women in Gilead in order to enlarge their territory. Those are Israelites. People who lived in Gilead, the Ammonites came over there. They didn't want a part of that territory. They didn't want to just push the people out. They wanted to get rid of the lineage of the Israelites there. So they killed even innocent women and children. And God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, is judging these folks. Then, chapter 2, verse 1, thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Moab. Moab's right here, the last one. Every single kingdom in the area has now been judged. For 3 transgressions of Moab, even for 4 I won't revoke punishment, because the king of Moab burned to lime the bones of the king of Edom. Now the people of Bethel might have been like, huh? What has every other judgment been about so far? Every other one's been about foreign people killing us.
Yeah.
But this one's about the king of Edom and the king of Moab. King of Moab burned to lime. It's almost like, what would Yahweh care about that? Foreign people can kill each other all they want, but what does that have to do with me? Well, burning, desecrating the bones of someone was just understood to be a bad thing. You just don't do that. It's kind of a crime against humanity, right? But it's one that, like, Yahweh is judging these people who have nothing to do with Israel. I mean, nothing to do, but they're kind of the borders of Israel there. That's kind of weird, but still, okay, yay, we hate the Moabites, great, okay. And then, verse 4, Yahweh says, for 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4 I will not revoke punishment, because they rejected the Torah of Yahweh. This is different here. Notice all the other crimes that have been judged here are crimes that just everyone should know. You don't kill women and children. You don't do that, right? God expects that the people of Moab know that you don't desecrate the bones of a foreign. You don't mess with human remains. You don't kill innocent kids, right? You don't do that. And God is going to judge you because you know that. But Judah is held to a different standard. How is Judah being judged? Because it didn't follow the Torah. And how did it not follow? It didn't follow the statutes, they went straight. Now, this is the northern kingdom, and Amos is from the south. He's from Judah. He's got that southern accent, and he's talking to the people in the north. And they can tell that he's from the south, and they're like, wait a minute. This southern guy is saying that God's going to get the southern people. I love this guy. This guy is telling God, God is telling us through this guy, right, that every other people around us, even his own people, are going to get it. Wow, this is the best southern prophet I ever heard in my life. All of them are so smug and self-righteous about their own kingdom, but this guy finally admits it, right? And then, notice we've had 7 oracles so far. Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab, and Judah, the last one, which would have been surprising to some of these folks. That's 7. Number of totality, completion. Oh, great. God's going to get rid of all of our enemies. Awesome. All right, everyone ready to go home? Amos says, wait. Got one more. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, the northern kingdom, and for 4 I will not revoke punishment. Now notice the indictment here. Notice, what is the indictment here? Because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. Father and son go into the same girl so that my holy name is profaned, using people as objects. selling lives for a pair of sandals, right? Cheap. Life is cheap here. It's cheap. There's so many people that are enslaved. It's buying someone is like nothing. People are objects to be used and abused. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. When they go have their religious feasts, they lay out a picnic blanket, and that picnic blanket literally is the garment, like the coat from someone who had to give it to them in pledge. And if you've read Exodus or Deuteronomy, you know that if someone gives you a coat in pledge, that is to say, if someone has no money left, and they take a loan and they give you their coat, you're supposed to give it back to them. That's what Moses says in Deuteronomy. You have to give it back to them. In fact, you have a letter, an actual physical letter from an ancient Israelite farmer who writes to a general who's in the region and says, I gave my coat in pledge, and the guy will give it back to me at night because I'm cold. Can you please? And that is to say, we have a literal letter from an ancient Israelite farmer referring to the law of Moses about this very thing. But here, Amos is saying, you've taken people's last coat and you're using it as a picnic blanket next to my altar during a worship service. The picnic after the service is being held on someone's coat, last coat. And in the house of their God, they drink wine bought with fines they impose. Where did you get the wine from? Oh, I got it from the store. Where did you get the money for the wine? I don't know, taxi. Them? Somewhere? These things didn't come out of thin air, is what Amos is saying. And notice these indictments. The indictment of Judah was that they weren't following the Torah, but the indictment of the northern kingdom isn't about the Torah. It isn't. At least Amos doesn't even say that right away. He doesn't say the law of Moses. What he says is, this is like all those other things. You just shouldn't do this. You shouldn't even have to have a law to tell you. It's like burning bones of a foreign king, or killing kids. You just should know you don't do that. It's not what you do. It's common human decency to not do these things that you're doing to the people, your kinfolk that are living around you. And then Amos launches into a little bit more. He says, God is the God of the whole earth. God cares not just about Israel, but God cares about everyone. And this does, so, in other words, people in Judah and in the northern kingdom might have thought, we are special because God chose us. That means God does whatever we want and helps us whatever we want, no matter what we've done. Like election or being chosen is like a get-out-of-jail-free card. And Amos says, in fact, election, if you remember back to yesterday, right before the covenant, God said, the covenant, the whole purpose of it is to transform you into the people who are going to be blessing to all the peoples of the world. That's the point of it. The point wasn't to get out of jail free card. If you look at Amos chapter 3, verse 1, Amos says, hear this word that Yahweh has spoken against you, O people of Israel, against the whole family that I brought up out of the land of Egypt. You're a family, and I saved you from being enslaved. Look what you've become. Look what you're doing to your kinfolk now. Amos says, God says through Amos, you only have I known from all the families of the earth. What kind of language is that? I have chosen you out of all the families of the earth. Election, like selection, right? I'm special. And God says, therefore I will punish you for your iniquities. Why were you chosen? So you could sit in your laurels and take stuff from other people? No. You were chosen to be part of a mission. And that mission was to bring blessing to all the peoples of the world. And what are you doing with it, right? What are you doing with this, the blessing I've given you? Oh, you've hoarded it for yourself. Election is election to the task of spreading the blessing. Election isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. Amos also has something to say about these foreigners. If you look at chapter 9, verse 7, Amos has a little more to say about being special. Amos says, yes, you're special, but you're not the only special ones. Chapter 9, verse 7, Amos says, Are you not like the Ethiopians to me, O people of Israel, says Yahweh? The people of Israel would have said, no, we are not like the Ethiopians to you. We are special because you picked us, and therefore we are special. The Ethiopians were not chosen by Yahweh, so they are not special. That's the way that these people would have been thinking, right? But God says, didn't I bring Israel up from the land of Egypt? Yes, you brought us up from the land, you saved us, you brought us up from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, from Crete. And the Arameans from Kir, which is in the Central Asian steppe, the place where the Aramean people originated, and they moved to Syria. God said, I brought you up from Egypt. And you know why the Philistines lived next door to you? Because they were dying, and I gave them a place to live. I saved them. I brought them to this area, and I settled them there. Election doesn't mean that God has nothing to do with other people, that God hates other people. Yeah.
So, Hebrew question.
Yes.
Yada,
Yeah. No.
which is translated chosen,
Yeah.
means, at least in the lexicon, to know.
Yeah.
So, to our English ears, hearing you only have I known is different than you only have I chosen.
Yeah, so chosen is a little bit more interpretive.
Okay.
It's adding a little bit more to it, but in a way that's trying to help us understand what that word would have meant in this context. So as we all know, or as we all have engaged, to know in the biblical sense, right, can mean a lot of different things,
Sure.
including sexual relations. But also it can mean family relations, like I have known you, meaning like this is my kin, this is my family. Sometimes that can be used like he knew his wife in a sexual sense, but more often it's actually used in just like relational sense. Like it's more than just I know about you. It's
Right.
that you are my kin. So that's to say, here God is saying, of all the families of the earth, I have known you. In other words, I have chosen, I've made a special relationship with you.
Okay.
In the same way that I'll be like, of all the people, all the women in the world, I know my wife the best. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
that.
yeah.
So,
But to that point, when I say, have I chosen, you say that's interpreted.
it is.
Well, there again, that's almost heresy. That creates a whole host of misunderstandings.
Sure.
I chose you, okay, but I know that might be why we have trouble with enough of that.
Well, yeah, there's a sense that like, am I chosen so I'm so special that I get what I want? And this is actually the way that the kings sometimes interpret this. Like David, God loves me, so I can do what I want. I can take Bathsheba. I can arrange for the murder of Uriah. I'm king. God gave me the power. If we look at 2 Samuel 7, a promise was given to David, a covenant made with David, where God said, hey, I'm going to love you no matter what. And we can get a sense that David might have, at times, interpreted that a little too broadly. God says, I love you no matter what. Ooh, that means I can do whatever I want, right? And I don't know, but I think there might be some Christians today that might hear the words that God loves you no matter what. And they might think, great. That means on my deathbed I'll say I love you, Jesus, and I can do whatever I want between now and then, and it won't matter. And what we hear from the prophets, but we also hear from Jesus, is that knowing God, or loving God, or being in relationship with God, is something that inevitably, if it's actually happening, leads to this transformation, to becoming a people of the blessing. It's not a get out of jail free card. That's a complete misunderstanding of how this whole thing works. Is that another way of thinking
What's
about
the Greek equivalent? Like, how would the Septuagint translate chosen? Like, would that be the same word that Paul would use in Ephesians 1? Like,
So-
I've predestined you. I mean, is it a Presbyterian kind of word?
The word used in Septuagint here is actually to know.
Okay.
Because it's a direct translation. But by the time of Paul sometimes uses the word to know in Greek, but also sometimes uses the word to be chosen or to choose.
It's like, get in my...
Yeah, get mine to be knowing. Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So that would be what would be here.
Mhm.
Okay.
What I'm kind of hearing is, to be chosen is you have a responsibility.
Yes, you've been chosen for this special task, which comes with special.
Which means you have to work.
Yes, you've been chosen for a special responsibility, which is itself a blessing. If you commit yourself to it, you're gonna reap way more blessings than you get for this. At the same time, and again, this is not salvation. God says, "I saved you. You are saved." At the beginning of Exodus 19, I saved you. You saw how I saved you. The beginning of the Ten Commandments, I saved you. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You've been saved. The question is now, how are you going to live? And if you think that, salvation just kind of covers, like I've been saved so I can do whatever I want. That's exactly what Amos is talking about here. It's death. And it's going to lead to death. And what Amos says is that it's leading to the death of many people that you're not even paying attention to because you're walking over their bodies as you go into the town in the morning. But also it's going to eventually lead to your death too. Amos's whole point is this leads inevitably to the destruction, not just of individual lives, but of communities. And that's going to bring everyone down eventually. So Amos is he's primarily speaking to people who are elite, people who like are in charge of these things, like the king. He talks to the king, right? And the king's, this is conspiracy against the king, it's treason against the king. But primarily he's talking to these folks who have some power to control things or to influence things. Like he says, we need to remember what we're being called to. Yeah, did you have a question?
I was just wondering, we today, when we accept the Lord into our lives,
Mhm.
and we ask the Lord to come into our lives,
Yeah.
is that referred to, it's not a covenant, it's, what is that referred to? I mean, I've known the Lord since the day I was born.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to understand, they say people that don't know enough to do that, they're still the Lord's, the Lord's still there with them. That's not a covenant, though.
That is a great question, and one that I might, just for sake of time, can we, maybe I'll address that tomorrow, if that makes sense. That is an excellent question. Yeah, also leads us far, a little bit away from Amos, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah,
But I'll-
definitely.
Great
There was
question.
one that was there and I needed to ask.
I'm gonna note that one down, so I'll get back to that tomorrow. So yeah, the question of salvation, and yeah, we'll talk about that for sure. Great. So this is so the idea of Amos is that Yahweh is king of the whole earth, and as king of the whole earth, Yahweh can decide what's going on with the Moabites, the Edomites, and so on as well. But also that Yahweh loves the whole earth. The Ethiopians, the Egyptians, the Philistines, the Arameans, God has provided for them too. So Amos also critiques this northern kingdom and the southern kingdom as well. But he's that southerner who's in the north who ends up saying, by the way, you got some big problems. If we take a look at chapter 6, he has words of critique for both Jerusalem and Samaria, the capital of the south and the north. Chapter 6, verse 1, Amos says, alas, or woe. When you see that word woe or alas, it's a song that someone would sing over someone who had just died. This is a song of grief over a recently deceased person. Except, Amos is singing it over people who are still very much alive and powerful. It's supposed to be ironic. It's supposed to capture people's attention. Wait, you're singing a song about how they died? They're right there. It's supposed to snap people out of their notions of reality. So the prophets often speak in surprising ways, sometimes shocking ways, because they feel that they need to shock people out of their daily life. They just accept this is the way it is. I got to step over these poor people to get into the temple. I have to own this person. I just have to. Like, what else would I do? I would not own them? You know, that's crazy. They just live their lives, and everything seems normal to them. And the prophets need to wake them up to the fact that this is actually not normal. This is, in fact, highly abnormal, right? That this is crazy the way we're living, right? So the prophets are trying to wake them up. So, alas, or woe, or I'm sorry that you're dead, those who are at ease in Zion. Zion meaning Jerusalem. The people who are luxuriating in Jerusalem are dead and they don't know it. Those who feel secure on Mount Samaria, the palace of the king. If you feel secure or at ease in these places, I'm sorry, but you're living in danger. The notables of the first of the nations to whom the house of Israel resorts. Cross over from Calneh and see, go to Hamath the Great, and go down to Gath of the Philistines. These are foreign places. Go to these foreign places. Are you any better than these kingdoms? Are you better than the Philistines? You think you're better than them just because God said God loved you? Look at how you're living. You're not any better than these people. Is your territory greater than their territory? Oh, you that put far away the evil day and bring near a reign of violence? You think you're living in peace, but in fact, what you are living in is a reign of terror. And you are inflicting it on your own people, worse than these foreigners could ever do. Alas, or woe, or I'm sorry that you're dead, those who lie on beds of ivory. Remember that ivory bed I showed you? Alas for those who lie on beds of ivory and lounge on their couches and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp and like David, improvise on instruments of music. Amos loves music, but Amos is saying the people who are spending their time trying to while away their hours with luxuries and big parties. Remember those big parties I showed you? Amos is mad about that. When you're doing that and drinking these wine from bowls, verse 6. Remember that big bowl I showed you? Cyrus? Yeah. This is that kind of party. He likes music. But the kind of stuff, the kind of parties they're having, who anoint themselves with the finest oils but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph, that is the king. You're not aggrieved over the ruin of your king. Therefore, they shall not be the first to go into exile, and the revelry of the loungers shall pass away. And in fact, in the time of the exile, the farmers mostly remained in the land. It was the elite that were taken into exile. Amos was right. If you turn back to chapter 5. Amos says that there is hope. There is hope. And he says, in chapter 5, verse 4, thus says Yahweh to the house of Israel, seek me and live. But don't seek Bethel. Don't go to Gilgal or cross over to Beersheba. These are places with big chapels, big temples. Don't go to the big temple looking for me, because I'm not actually there. Amos has a critique of worship. I'm going to move to this image here, right? He's got this big critique of what we might call the cult. Not meaning cult like we mean it today, just meaning worship. He critiques the worship system. Now, I don't think Amos hates worship. I think he loves worship. But he's got a big problem with people going to these temples and trying to look for God to give them a get out of jail card. Or to give enough stuff so that God ends up saying, okay, kind of like a bargain, God, you're going to bribe God. I'll forgive you. You've given me enough rams. If you look at Amos chapter 5, verse 10, they hate, he's talking to these folks who run Israel and Jerusalem. They hate the one who reproves in the gate. That's him. He's standing in the gate where people would gather, and he's yelling to everyone. He's saying, you've done something wrong. They abhor the one who speaks the truth because you trample on the poor and take from them levies of grain. You have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not live in them. You planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink their wine. For I know how many are your transgressions, how great are your sins, you who afflict the righteous, who take a bribe, push aside the needy in the gate. Therefore the prudent will keep silent in such a time, for it's an evil time. If you're smart, he says, you're not going to say anything about this, because if you talk about it, guess what's going to happen to you? Remember I said Amos talked for 1 year, somewhere less than a year? The first and last story we ever hear of Amos is the king sending the priest being like, this is treason. And the priest says to him, it's treason to say this, you're going to get killed if you say this. And he says back to him, well, I'm going to keep saying it. The prudent will keep silent at a time like this, but Amos feels like he needs to speak. And that's why Amos was probably executed. Though it doesn't tell us that in the story, it doesn't leave much to the imagination. All right, look at verse 14. Seek good and not evil, that you may live. Seek good, so that Yahweh, the God of hosts, will be with you. This was a thing that people said in the temple. Yahweh is with us. Yahweh is here. Yahweh is with us. Yahweh lives with us. Yahweh is for us. Yahweh is with us. Because we are Israel, we are chosen, we are special. Yahweh is with us. Yahweh is for us. But Amos says, no, you have to leave the temple. Remember, he's like usually outside the temple kind of yelling at people. He says, you have to leave this place. And you have to go other places to find Yahweh, so that God will be with you. Hate evil and love good and establish justice in the gate. It may be that Yahweh, the God of hosts, will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. And everyone who's left today, God might be generous to, but you got to change. The transformation comes first. And then look at verse 18. Alas, or woe for you who desire the day of Yahweh. Why do you want the day of Yahweh? It's darkness, it's not light. So the day of Yahweh was this day. This is an image of Asher, the king, the god king of Assyria, of the Assyrian Empire. And he was often imaged kind of following the battle of in front of the Assyrian army with his bow out. He would just kill people. And as the god of the Assyrians went in front of them and killed all their enemies. And that was the day of Asher. The day of our God is the day when our God kills all our enemies. But you kind of see this little hint of it at the beginning of Amos, right? Yahweh's going to get all our enemies. That's the day of Yahweh. They were cheering for the deaths of their enemies. But Amos says, you're cheering for the day of Yahweh? That day is darkness for you, not light. It's going to be bad for you, not good, when Yahweh shows up. Because when Yahweh shows up, what do you think Yahweh's going to see? People that Yahweh loves being trampled into this is going to be awful. Yahweh's going to get real mad. It's kind of like, kids, like they're like having a big party in the parents' house and the parents are away and the parents come home. Oh no. The parent, like, his stomach starts to sink. Like you see the toilet paper in the front yard. Oh no. Uh-oh, it's coming, right? It's going to be darkness, not light, as if someone fled from a lion. The Assyrian Empire was seen as it imaged itself in the image of a lion, right? Even if you could save yourself from this lion, you're going to go then you're met by a bear. Yahweh is the bear. Like you think you're going to escape the Assyrians? Well, Yahweh's going to be right there waiting for you. Or say you go into a house. You like, whoo, I escaped a lion and a bear today. And then you come home and you put your hand on the wall and it was bitten by a snake. Yahweh's gonna get you. You can't escape Yahweh. You can't escape justice. And then he says, it's not the day of the Lord, darkness, not light, and gloom with no brightness in it. For you. And you know what it's gonna be to the people that you're hurting? It's gonna be deliverance and joy. Yahweh gets rid of pharaohs. Amos talks about the Exodus a whole lot. Yahweh destroyed Pharaoh's empire. Why? Not all at once. Pharaoh had, the Israelites were enslaved for 300 years. There were lots of chances given to Pharaoh for Pharaoh to change. You have to let these people go. You have to let them go. And God gave signs, little ones at first, and then bigger ones, and then bigger ones. You have to let them go. You have to let them go. And eventually, God had no choice but to take apart Pharaoh's kingdom. God had to do it. Now, why doesn't God just snap the divine fingers and make the world better? I don't know, but it has something to do with our choice and our freedom and our ability to be humans, I think. But all to say that this is Amos telling these folks, you are going to be destroyed like you hope happens to your enemies if you don't change. And then he says, look at verse 21. This is the famous part here. I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Now, God actually likes it when we worship. But God hates this kind of worship, where you get together and make beautiful music, played on instruments that are taken from poor people, right? Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. The Hebrew here is smell. God says, I don't want to smell your burnt offerings. Ugh. The offerings and well-being of your fat animals, I will not look upon. God won't smell. God won't look. Take away from me the noise of your psalms. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. God's shutting off God's senses when it comes to Israel. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That's what God wants. An ever-flowing stream was like a river that never gave up, right? I want justice and righteousness. These are different ideas. Justice really was the idea of the whole system working right. And righteousness was individual choices that contributed to this or took away from it. And both of these are important. How we function as a group and how we function as individuals are interlocked and can't be taken apart. And Amos talks about both of them, like many of the prophets. So let me turn this real quick. Last thing I'll say. Let me turn this real quick to Micah, just to show us how similar this is. The book of Micah is a little bit further on than Minor Prophets. So Micah speaks at the same time as Amos. He's a little after Jonah as Micah. He speaks at the same time as Amos, but to the southern kingdom. And Micah was from a place called Morsheth Gath, which is a tiny little farming village that got turned into a royal fortress, royal garrison. And the local farmers had to build the garrison, and then they had to feed the soldiers. And this is a fortress that was on the border between Philistia and Judah. It was a royal garrison to keep peace. Morsheth was near Gath, which was a Philistine city. Morsheth Gath. And here it is today, this little knob of a hill, had a fortress on top. And Micah is this guy who is consumed with worry and concern. Micah says, if we turn to Micah chapter 2, it says, alas for those who devise wickedness and evil deeds on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it because it's in their power. So at night, some people are dreaming about stealing from other people. He says they covet fields and they seize them, houses and they take them away. Remember that village? And the land was consolidated. They oppress householder and house people and their inheritance. This is that word that means the land. People are taking other people's land and consolidating it. Now, therefore, I'm devising against this family an evil from which you cannot remove your necks. That is to say, God is going to break this system. On verse 4, on that day they shall take up a taunt against you and wail and bear lamentation and say, we are utterly ruined. The Lord alters the inheritance of my people, that is Nahalah, and removes it from me. What he's saying, Micah is saying, is one day all this property that you've taken from other people is going to be taken from you, and you're going to cry on that day and say, oh, poor me. But it's going to be given back to the people who actually have that land. And in chapter 3, verse 9, Micah says, hear this, you rulers of the house of Jacob, the chiefs of the house of Israel, who abhor justice and pervert all equity, who build Zion or Jerusalem with blood and Jerusalem with wrong. Its rulers give judgment for a bribe, its priests teach for a price, its prophets give oracles for money. Yet they lean upon the Lord, upon Yahweh, and say, surely Yahweh is with us. Notice this chosenness that actually is being used as a justification for hurting the very people that they were entrusted to care for. No harm shall come upon us. Get out of jail free card theology. Therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field. Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house, the palace of the king, a wooded height. Jerusalem's coming down. And last thing I'll ask you to look at is the most famous. If you know one thing in Micah, it's Micah 6:8. Micah 6:8 is a part of this larger conversation that's shared among these 8th century prophets. And it's part of a larger conversation within that chapter. Notice at the beginning of chapter 6, God says, hear what the Lord says, rise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. It's a lawsuit. The covenant was understood to be a legally binding document, and there are many lawsuit oracles. That is to say, the prophet says, God is suing you in court for breach of contract. So you need to stand up and plead your case. Rise and plead your case before the mountains. The mountains and the hills are like the jury. Because God's so big, you need mountains to be the jury. You can't have people. Here, you mountains, the controversy, or what word do you all have there? The controversy. Do you have an idea? Accusation. The real Hebrew word here is reeve, which means lawsuit. Here, the lawsuit, or like when you wanted to sue someone in court, you would say this word. Here, the controversy, the lawsuit, etc., of the Lord. And you enduring foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a controversy with his people, or a lawsuit with his people. God is suing his people, and he will contend with Israel legally in court. Oh, my people. This is God's talking in court here. Oh, my people, what have I done to you? And what have I wearied you? Answer me. Hey, I brought you up out of the land of Egypt. I redeemed you from the house of slavery. I sent before you Moses and Aaron and Miriam. Oh, my people, remember now what King Balak of Moab devised, what Balaam son of Beor said. These are people who tried to kill Israel when they were in the wilderness. God says, I preserved you. I gave you leaders that were good. I brought you into this land. I redeemed you from slavery. That you may know the saving acts of the Lord. I did all this stuff for you so you can know that I save people who are vulnerable. That's what I do. And then the people respond in verse 6. God's accusation is, you have hurt the poor. Verse 6, with what shall I come before Yahweh and bow myself to God on high? Shall I come to Yahweh with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will Yahweh be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000 rivers of oil? What are the people trying to say to God in court? What was that? What would the judge say if in court you like walk up to the plaintiff and you're like, what if I give you 10,000 rivers of oil? You walk up to the police officer, excuse me, what if I give you my house, okay? What about that, okay? And we just pretend this didn't happen. Yeah, this is them trying to bribe God, trying to pay off God. With 10,000 rivers of oil, where did that oil come from? They're not understanding the point. Will the Lord be pleased with these things? And then, verse 7 in the middle, shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? Maybe God wants a baby. Okay, how about that? I'll give you whatever you want. The fruit of my body for the sin of my soul. You want human life? I'll give you my kid, whatever. And then the prophet responds in court. God told you, O mortal, that is, remember, God made you. God told you, O mortal, what is good. And a bribe isn't it. And what does Yahweh require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. God doesn't want stuff. God wants justice. Especially for the vulnerable. That's what God is asking for. So Micah 6:8 is part of this larger conversation that is itself a part of this larger problem that Israel's having in the 8th century of BC. And we can see echoes of this in the New Testament as well. I'll read you another part. I'll end with this. I know I said that was the last one, but I can't end there. Gotta have one more little bit of Micah. If you turn back to chapter 5, verse 2 of Micah. Micah's got a little bit more to say. It's not just bad things, but God has a future plan for you. Part of the prophets is to help people imagine a future that they can't yet see. And here we get Micah showing these people who he's just told, you are doing exactly the wrong thing. Here is a vision of an alternate reality. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, it's a little tiny rural village of Bethlehem, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel. His origin is from old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor is brought forth. And the rest of his kindred shall return to the people of Israel. He shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of Yahweh, in the majesty of the name of Yahweh his God, and they shall live secure. For now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be the one of peace. Now, these folks who are hearing this, they don't know who he's talking about. There's no name right now. But what's given here is there will be someday someone who's going to come and transform this world, who's going to show us an alternative way of being a king. Why is Bethlehem mentioned? Not just because of Jesus, because of David. David was the king for Bethlehem. David was born in Bethlehem. He's from Bethlehem. It's David's city. It's a tiny little area, but yeah, David's from this little rural area. But here, there's going to be another king coming who's going to do things in a very different way. His focus is going to be on feeding his sheep, humbly walking with God, right? With God's strength. And everyone then shall live secure, and he's going to be one who brings true peace. Not just the end of hostility, but he's going to bring one who brings true peace. That is, everyone living the way that God intended, a life of blessing. With that, I'll wrap up. I'll stay for questions, and folks can ask questions if they like. I know some folks might need to go. But tomorrow, we're going to pick up this story with the time of the exile, the story of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Slightly different historical context, but one that also gives us both grief, but also hope.
Awesome. Any questions for Brennan?
Glad we don't pay by the word.
We'll talk about that for next time.
We have one over here, Brennan.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
How many times is the Old Testament referring to Jesus? I don't know.
That's an open question in some ways. And one way to think about it is like, would people at the time have understood that this was a reference to Jesus? This would have been very shady to them. They would not have understood this to be a direct reference to Jesus in some way. What they would have understood is, hey, there's going to be someone coming who's going to totally transform the way we think about power, about rule, and it was something that they could begin to enact in their own lives at the time. There are other references to Jesus that may be a little bit harder to pin down in some ways. So people will have different kind of counts of this, different tallies, but dozens at least. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I was never aware of it. I mean, years ago, I became aware of that. Reading the Bible, I was never aware of what but somebody brought that to my attention.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming today. Hopefully I'll see some of y'all tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.
9 a.m. Yes, in the Kingston building. 9 a.m. in the Kingston building.
Thanks again for coming. And,
Yes.